Bai Juyi, The Song of Endless Sorrow. Now, Bai Juyi's Song of Endless Sorrow is the biggest poem contained in this anthology. It occupies a total of almost 5 pages in this volume, and it's also a dense poem. It deals with a very important historical event, the climax, or it could arguably be said, of the Tang dynasty, which is the fall from power of its greatest emperor, Tang Xuanzong, the murder of his concubine, and his exile. So it requires a great deal of commentary in most of the lines and couplets. So I've decided that I'm going to divide the talk about this poem into 2 parts. The first part, which is the one I'll upload today, is going to be a presentation on the figure of Bai Juyi and on the background behind this poem. And I'll also read the poem itself. Next day, we will continue with a couplet by couplet commentary on the meaning of the poem. So first of all, Bai Juyi. This is the first poem, but it won't be the last, of Bai Juyi in the collection. Who was Bai Juyi? Now, Bai Juyi is a mid-Tang poet, and he is arguably the best, or at least the most influential of the mid-Tang poets. He lived a pretty long life. I think he overpassed the 7 decades in his life. And, well, his is the typical story of a scholar official, but with rather more success than usual. He passed not only 1, but 3 different examinations, and he was a close friend of another poet who had an even more successful political career than he, Yuan Chen. Both were very, very mid-Tang poets. That is to say, they were obsessed with a return to the old, pure writing styles of the past. In their case, especially in the case of Bai Juyi, he was more focused on poetry than on prose. But one of the things which he managed was the renewal of the old Juifu, of the old ballads type poetry. In fact, he was famous for a collection of 100 new style Juifu, the Xin Juifu, and other poets or others of his contemporaries imitated him. And this was a poetry of social compromise. It wasn't an imitation of the old ballads, except in the spirit of poetry that represented the hardships, the difficulties of the lower classes during the Tang era, and they were especially hostile and vicious towards corrupt and greedy politicians and merchants. Confucians always have a big problem with merchants, whom they see as little more than parasites. Now, going back to Bai Juyi, as I said, he was a great poet, very self-conscientious of his literary works. In fact, he made many collections and editions of his own works, and a lot of his poetry has survived. In fact, I think 1/10 of all Tang dynasty poetry that has been preserved today is his. One of the characteristics of his style that we've just mentioned was his interest for the poor, for the downtrodden. And this goes hand in hand with a style that is generally quite simple. So he runs away from excessively pedantic or rhetorical or literati type poetry. He likes to represent the suffering of the lower classes. And what else can we say about Bai Juyi? As I said, he was moderately successful politically. He had some mid to high posts in the bureaucracy. He was for 2 years governor of Hangzhou, which is I'm mentioning it because it's a region in China that is very beautiful, and it was also the home place of one of the greatest Chinese poets, Xu Xi. Okay, besides talking about the common people, he talked in a common speech, or as common as poetry would accept in the Tang dynasty. And there is the legend that he used to recite his poems to one of his maidens working at his home, an old lady, I think. And if she didn't understand any words that appeared in the poem, he would change them. So what more can we say about Bai Juyi that might be relevant? He was also quite close to Buddhism. In fact, he is more known as Bai Lotian, and he wrote some poems and texts praising Buddhism. Some of his nature poetry also has Buddhist connotations. Because of his simplicity, he was also quite popular outside of China. I think he was the most popular Tang dynasty poet until very recent times in Japan, where he was called Hakurakuten. And as I said, he was extremely popular. And he was almost contemporaneously popular, which was quite a feat. That is to say, at the same time as his poems were being written in China, copies were arriving in Japan. Okay, I think this deals with the background of Bai Juyi. He is one of the greatest poets in the tradition, but he is not very well represented in this anthology. And I imagine he would be turning in his grave if he knew that the first poem of his to be included here is the Song of Everlasting Sorrow, the Song of Endless Sorrow, Chang Hen Ko. Now, this poem is a very famous poem in Chinese literature, but it's a poem that does not follow Bai Juyi's usual style. I mean, he wrote lots of poems. He has poems in all types. But as I said, his peculiar style is this worrying for the people, for the oppressed type of poem. And this is completely different. This has nothing to do with that. This is a very long poem chronicling the affairs of Emperor Tang Xuanzong, the bright emperor, and his tragic relationship with his beloved concubine, Jiang Guifei. So we've given some background about Bai Juyi. Now we have to give some background about the Song of Endless Sorrow and its protagonists, Emperor Xuanzong and Jiang Guifei. So, Emperor Xuanzong, Li Longji, later known as the Bright Emperor, was emperor during the first half of the 8th century in China, basically from 710 to 756. And his period is generally considered the most splendorous, the most glorious of the entire Tang dynasty. It was a period of splendor, of riches, of successful foreign expansion, of cultural flourishing. So, it was the zenith of Tang power, culture, splendor, and was idealized forevermore in later ages, but already by the contemporary poems and poets that were written under the Bright Emperor. Now, Li Longji, the Bright Emperor, was quite a good emperor, but he lived for a very long time, and when he was old, he started to leave affairs of government into the hands of ministers and favorites. And as legend goes, he especially became besotted by a very, very beautiful concubine, Jiang Guifei. This woman had entered the palace as a concubine for one of his own sons, but she had, because of her beauty, she had been taken by the emperor himself. And he had even appointed some of her relatives to important court positions. And this would generate complications because of the relationships of these relatives of the consort Jiang with notoriously with General An Lushan, the barbarian general who served in the northeastern frontiers of the empire and who would very soon rebel. Now, I've already talked about one very common Chinese conceit in their culture and poetry, which is the idea of the kingdom toppling beauty. From the Book of Odes onwards, there is this idea, very prevalent in historical texts, that good emperors can, or not so good, but rulers can be corrupted by the pleasures of office, especially women. And it was believed, somewhat misogynistically, that some women, some of these seductive beauties, were responsible and were guilty for bringing down dynasties. So in the historical records, we can read names of beautiful ladies that distracted the emperors and led to the end of their reign and of their dynasty. In both the legendary Xia, the Shang dynasties, there's a historical one, Bao Si, the wife of the last emperor of Western Zhou, whose capital was sacked and he murdered. And so this is a very common trope. We've also mentioned it in at least a couple of poems here, including one that talked about Shishi, who had been used as a weapon to weaken the king of Wu so that her native kingdom of Yue would be able to take revenge and destroy this neighboring adversarial kingdom. So this is a big tradition. And this tradition has probably as its most famous latter-day representative in Jiang Guifei, and with the same idea. This is a ravishingly beautiful woman who is cultured, who is all a man can desire, and the aged emperor just forgets all the affairs of state and just wastes time enjoying her and enjoying cultural pleasures and pastimes with her. So this poem is going to describe that besotment, that relationship. It's going to describe those pleasures of the emperor and Jiang Guifei. Basically, Chinese poetry is usually quite prudish, so it's mainly going to focus directly on their common musical pursuits. They both enjoyed patronizing musicians, and the emperor himself was quite a good flute player, I believe. But anyway, that's the splendorous background of the poem before the fall, which is the main action that will take place in the poem. The An Lushan rebellion in 755 tears the empire apart. In 756, the rebels take the capital, and the emperor is forced to flee with his retinue towards the city of Chengdu in Shu. And about 30 miles west from the capital, at the Mawei post station, his troops mutiny. They refuse to continue unless Jiang Guifei and her relatives are put to death. The emperor is forced to accept this. He has no choice. And she was strangled by a eunuch. And a little bit later, shortly after this, the emperor arrives in Chengdu. He is replaced in the throne by one of his sons, Emperor Xuanzong. And later, when the capital is recovered from the barbarians in 757, the retired emperor goes back to live in the capital. Of course, he continues living a life of relative splendor, but he is marked by the melancholy, the sadness, the disgrace, the tragedy of having lost the one woman he truly loved. So, this is a very melodramatic subject matter, yeah? How the emperor, the most glorious emperor, loses his beloved and his kingdom and lives on in anguish and in pain, reminiscing her. So many later plays, Chinese opera, poems would represent, would recreate this topic. But the first, only a few decades after, less than half a century after the events had taken place, the first of these poems to be written, as far as I know, is Bai Juyi's The Song of Endless Sorrow. And this poem has become, as I said, very popular. It does not represent the standard poetry, or at least the one that Bai Juyi thought was his most representative, most valuable, most useful poetry. But, well, that usually happens. Yeah? Poets, writers sometimes are not appreciated for the works they would like to be appreciated, but for others. So after making this big introduction, let's read the poem. I'll just read it, and as I said, next day I'll comment it couplet by couplet. The Song of Endless Sorrow. The Han Emperor craved women and sought a perfect beauty. Years he ruled, and yet he had not found her. The Yang clan had a girl, just growing up, raised in the women's quarters. Few had seen her. Such beauty, a gift of heaven, should not be wasted. On the day they brought her to the palace, our ruler first saw her. A sidelong glance, a little smile from this beauty, and all the other women in 6 palaces came to nothing. In the spring chill they bathed her in the Huaqing pool. The water of the warm springs glistened on her pale skin. Her maids lifted her out, languid from the heat, and there, for the first time, she received her master's favor. Her hair was like clouds in a golden headdress, her face a flower. They passed spring nights, warm behind hibiscus curtains. Spring nights so bitterly short, and yet the sun rose high. From that time on, he held no morning audience. Endlessly they sought pleasure at parties and banquets. Endless love they sought in endless spring, night and night again. In harem palaces, 3,000 beauties, but all were nothing, and one was everything. In her golden room, her makeup perfect, she alone would serve him. After banquets, in jade towers, wine fed their passion. Her sisters and brothers were all ennobled. Everyone envied the glory she brought to her clan. Until, through the world, Parents' hearts prayed for a daughter and not for a son. Her new palaces rose on Mount Li, touching the clouds, and everywhere magical music drifted on the wind. Softly she sang, and softly she danced to the music of flute and strings. Day after day the emperor watched and listened, craving more. But the sound of other music, martial drums, came from Yuyang, and it shook the earth, ending her dance of the rainbow dress and the feathered coat. The 9-storied city gates were wrapped in smoke and dust as 1,000 chariots and 10,000 men rode out to the southwest. His banners waved in the wind as they marched and then stopped. West of the palace gates, only 30 miles or so. The 6 armies would go no farther. What could he do? They dragged his beauty to her death beneath their horses. Her flowery pin fell to the earth. No one received it. Not the jade and golden ornaments from her hair. Her emperor hid his face. He could not save her. When finally he looked, her blood and tears had run together. Yellow dust covered everything, blown on a mournful wind. They climbed into clouds, the winding Sword Peak Road. When they passed below Emei Mountain, few watched them. Their flags were dark and dull in the fading light. Shu rivers still ran blue. Shu mountains remained green. Oblivious to all, grief filled his endless days and nights. Moonlight in the borrowed palace only wrenched his heart the more. On rainy nights, bells wrung his heart. Time passed. At last he journeyed homeward. But when he reached that spot again, he stopped, could not go on. Below Mawei's slope, into the muddy earth, her pale face was gone. The scene of her death, just emptiness. Lords and ministers eyed each other, robes soaked with tears. Looking east towards the palace gates, their horses led them home. They returned to find her ponds and gardens as before. Lake Taiye hibiscus and Weiyang palace willows. The hibiscus like her face, the willows her eyebrows. Seeing all this, how could his tears not fall? In spring wind, peach and plum both blossomed. In fall rain, tung trees dropped their leaves. Western palace, southern hall grew thick with autumn grass. Red leaves fell and covered stairs where no one swept. The actors and dancers of her pear garden all grew grey. The eunuchs of her private suite, aged like fading flowers. At dusk, in his rooms, he shared his quiet thoughts with fireflies. His single lamp flickered out. Sleep could not find him. Drums and bells told the hours slowly in the endless night, till a gleam in the stars told dawn would come at last. On nights so cold, frost grayed the bright mandarin ducks on the roof tiles. He was chill beneath the kingfisher quilt that none could share. The living and the dead apart, a year went by, and her ghost never came to him, even in dreams. There was a Taoist from Linqiong, then dwelling in the capital. Pure of heart, he could bring back souls from the dead, they said. Moved by the emperor's deep grief, he sent his disciples to seek her in every quarter. They rose into the sky and flew like lightning, and soaring to the heavens, or deep upon the earth, gazed up into the endless blue and deep as the yellow springs. But both they found empty. She was not there. Then he heard of a magical island out in the eastern sea, a mountain dividing nowhere from the very edge of nothing. At its peak, magnificent towers rose in multicolored clouds. There, beautiful spirits lived eternities. One was a woman called Most Faithful, snowy skin and lovely face. Was she the one they sought? He knocked on the jeweled door of her gold tower's western chamber and asked the maid Little Jade to announce him. News of a heavenly envoy from Emperor of the Han broke into her dreams as she slept within 9-flowered curtains. Reaching for her gown, pushing away her pillow, she stood unsteady, and then she parted her pearl curtains and her silver screen. Just awake, her cloud-like hair was all dishevelled. Her flowered headdress leaned askew as she came into the hall. A breeze blew open her fairy cloak. It rippled and fluttered, as if she danced again the rainbow dress and the feathered coat. Her sad, lonely face was awash in tears, like a sprig of pear blossoms wet with the rain of spring again. Touched, she met his eyes and thanked the emperor for sending this envoy. She said that since they had parted, she had never once heard his voice or seen his face. No longer could they share their love as in the shining palace. Alone here now in Paradise Hall, her days and months grew long. Sometimes she looked down into the world of the living, but she never saw Chang'an, only the dust and fog of war that covered it. Now she offered 2 old tokens of her deepest feelings: a case of silver filigree and a hairpin of gold to send home with the envoy. Of the pin she kept half, of the case 1 panel, breaking the gold of the pin and splitting the silver of the case. She prayed his love would last as long as the gold and silver, so that someday, in heaven or on earth, they might meet again. As the envoy left, she begged him also to carry back a message, whose words were a vow that only they two would ever know. On the 7th night of the 7th month, in the palace of long life, at midnight they had promised, where none could overhear them. In the sky we will be like birds with shared wings, on earth like trees with branches intertwined. Heaven is ancient, the world is old, but they will die. This sorrow, like an endless thread, will last forever.